She was invisible. That was the job. Clean the rooms, lower your eyes, carry the weight of a house that was never yours and never would be, and survive. Layla was a Black woman who had learned that silence was armor. In a mansion owned by one of the most feared Korean Mafia bosses in the city, a man whose name alone made grown men adjust their posture, she was just the help. Quiet, efficient, unseen. But someone saw her. On a Sunday morning, while the house still slept, she walked into the kitchen and watched a woman, polished, composed, dangerous in the way that only truly desperate people are dangerous, slide something into the spice jar that only Layla used. The motion lasted 4 seconds. The woman turned to the window like nothing had happened. Like Layla wasn't standing right there. Like a black maid in a uniform was furniture, was nothing. She said good morning. She made tea. She did not touch the jar, but she also did not forget. Because what that woman didn't know, what no one in that house had ever bothered to consider, was that the quiet ones are always watching, that the invisible ones remember everything, and that Layla Graves had been carrying a secret far bigger than her own survival, a secret that could destroy the very woman who had just tried to silence her, forever. What happened next shook that entire mansion to its foundation, and it started with a knock on a door that no one had ever dared knock on before. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click Join to become a member and help our channel. She had learned early that the safest thing a woman in her position could do was see nothing. Not the envelopes slipped under doors at midnight. Not the conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room carrying fresh linens and lowered eyes. Not the way certain guests arrived through the side entrance and left before the sun had any business being up. Layla Graves had mastered the particular stillness of someone who understood that survival, in a house like this, depended entirely on the quality of your silence. The mansion sat at the end of a private road that didn't appear on any map application a normal person would use. 3 floors, 12 rooms she was permitted to enter, 4 she was not. She had worked there for 2 years and 3 months. She knew which marble tiles clicked under pressure. She knew that the second-floor hallway held cold air no matter the season. She knew that Mr. Kwon took his coffee without sugar and his meetings without witnesses, and that those 2 facts, taken together, had kept her employed and unharmed longer than she sometimes thought she deserved. She was not naive about what kind of man he was, but she had also watched him kneel beside his younger brother in the kitchen one evening, when the boy had come in shaking and pale after something she was never told about. And she had watched Kwon Dae-Jung, a man whose name alone rearranged the posture of everyone around him, press his forehead gently against his brother's, and say nothing at all for a long time. She filed that image away, somewhere private. It did not make him good, but it made him human, which was its own kind of dangerous information. Vivian Chow arrived on a Thursday. She came with 2 suitcases and the particular confidence of a woman who had never been asked to wait for anything. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Deliberately, precisely, without a single accidental quality. Her perfume arrived in a room before she did. Her smile was the kind that required study to understand, because it never quite matched whatever she was actually feeling. Layla recognized her immediately. She had seen photographs. Everyone in the house had. Vivian had been engaged to Mr. Kwon for 14 months before something ended it. Something no one discussed out loud, and everyone understood implicitly. She had not been back since. Until Thursday. She was introduced to the staff as a temporary guest. Business matter. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. The housekeeper relayed this information with the flat tone of someone reading a weather report they didn't believe. Layla said nothing, went back to her work. It was 3 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning when the upper floor was empty and the house exhaled into its own stillness, that she came into the kitchen to prepare the spice rack for the week's meals. A task that belonged only to her. A small ritual she had built into her routine because order, in a house with very little of it, felt like something worth protecting. She saw Vivian at the counter. The woman's back was turned. Her hand moved quickly, precisely, toward the small amber jar that held the smoked paprika blend Layla used in almost everything she cooked for herself. The motion lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Vivian set the jar back exactly where it had been. Exactly. With the practiced care of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. Turned smoothly toward the window as though she had simply been admiring the garden, and said, without looking back, "Good morning, Layla." The sound of her own name in that mouth felt like a door closing. Layla looked at the jar, then at Vivian's perfectly composed profile, then back at the jar. She said good morning. She made tea. She did not touch the spice rack. And she stood at the window for a long time after Vivian left, watching the garden as if it might offer her something. An answer. A reason. A version of this moment that meant something other than what she already knew it meant. It didn't. 13:53. She spent the rest of that Sunday doing what she had always done in moments that frightened her. She worked. She scrubbed the guest bathroom until the grout between the tiles was whiter than it had any reason to be. She refolded the linen closet on the second floor, stacking towels by weight and color with the concentration of someone performing surgery. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, and anyone watching her would have seen only what they always saw, a woman doing her job with the particular devotion of someone who took pride in small things. What they would not have seen was the calculation happening behind her eyes. She had not eaten since the morning before, not from lack of hunger, from the specific, controlled discipline of a woman who understood that she needed to think before she acted, and that thinking required a kind of clarity that eating from that particular kitchen, with that particular jar sitting on the third shelf, could not guarantee her right now. By evening, the paprika jar was gone from the rack. She noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you had stopped consciously hearing. Suddenly, completely, with a small, cold drop in the chest. She stood in front of the spice rack for a long moment. Then she opened the cabinet below the sink, moved aside the cleaning supplies, and found it there, tucked behind a bottle of surface spray. Removed from its place and hidden with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided the problem was already handled. Vivian had come back for it. That told Layla everything she needed to know about the timeline. Whatever had been added to the jar was not meant to be found. It was meant to be consumed, slowly, unremarkably, over days, dissolved into her food in quantities small enough to read as nothing, until the nothing accumulated into something that could not be undone. She put the jar in her apron pocket. She finished her shift. She smiled at the housekeeper on her way out of the kitchen. That night, in her small room at the end of the east corridor, she sat on the edge of her bed and held the jar in both hands and thought about all the ways this could go. She could say nothing. That was the obvious choice, the safe choice. The choice that every practical instinct she had developed over 27 years was pointing toward with both hands. She was a domestic worker in a house that operated outside the visible world. She had no documentation of what she had seen. She had a glass jar and a Sunday morning memory, and the word of a woman who had a great deal more to lose than she did, which meant a great deal more motivation to make sure Layla's version of events never reached anyone with the authority to act on it. She could leave, pack what mattered, which was not much, and be gone before the house woke up. Start over somewhere that didn't require her to carry this particular weight. She had done it before, in smaller ways. She knew how. Or she could remember the thing she had been trying not to remember since Thursday. The document she had seen 3 weeks earlier, left open on the printer in the second-floor office when she had come in to clean. A single page, half visible before she had looked away out of trained reflex. Names she recognized. Figures she didn't understand but knew were large. And at the bottom, a signature she had no business seeing. The name of Kwon Dae-Jung's younger brother, printed in the authorization line of a financial transfer that Layla understood, even without knowing the specifics of how these things worked, was not something a 23-year-old boy would have arranged on his own. She had looked away. She had cleaned the printer tray. She had gone downstairs and made coffee and not thought about it again. Until now. Because now she understood what Vivian needed from her. Not her absence, not her silence, her voice. Specifically, the permanent removal of it. Not death, which would require investigation, attention, questions from people who might eventually look in directions that were inconvenient. Just silence. The clean, medical, irreversible kind. A woman who cannot speak cannot testify. A woman who cannot testify cannot explain what she saw on a printer on a Tuesday afternoon in October. A woman who cannot explain that cannot stand between Vivian Chow and the erasure of a crime she had committed and carefully arranged for someone else to carry. Layla set the jar down on the nightstand. She lay back on the bed without changing her clothes. She stared at the ceiling in the dark for a long time. She was already losing her voice. She had noticed it 2 days ago. A slight roughness at the back of her throat, a faint resistance when she swallowed. The kind of thing you dismiss as the beginning of a cold, because dismissing it is easier than the alternative. She had dismissed it. She did not dismiss it anymore. The ceiling offered her nothing. The house around her breathed its familiar nighttime sounds, the tick of the heating system, the distant settling of old walls, the particular silence of a place where power lived so comfortably it had stopped needing to announce itself. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 2 years and 3 months of careful, disciplined invisibility, Layla Graves made a decision that had nothing to do with staying safe. 1354. She wrote it down. Not on her phone, which she understood could be accessed by people with resources she didn't have. Not on the notepad by her bed, which was too visible, too findable, too much like evidence left carelessly in the open. She tore 3 pages from the back of a paperback novel she had read twice already, a story about a woman who survived something, and she wrote in the smallest handwriting she could manage, pressing lightly so the pen wouldn't leave impressions on the page beneath. She wrote what she had seen on the printer. She wrote the date, the names, the figures she could remember, and the specific position of the document on the tray. She wrote about the Sunday morning in the kitchen. She wrote about the jar. She wrote about her throat, which by that point felt like someone had lined it with sandpaper and was applying gentle, consistent pressure from the inside. She folded the pages into a square small enough to fit inside the inner lining of her left shoe, where she had once hidden $40 in cash during a period of her life she didn't discuss with anyone. Then she waited. Not passively. Layla Graves did not know how to wait passively. She watched Vivian with the careful, peripheral attention of someone who had spent years learning how to observe without appearing to observe. She noted the rhythm of the woman's movements through the house, which rooms she entered freely, which she approached with the slightly altered posture of someone performing casualness, which doors she stood near for a half-second too long before moving on. She noted that Vivian had begun watching her back. It was subtle, the kind of attention that would be invisible to someone who wasn't already looking for it. A glance held one beat longer than social courtesy required. A particular stillness when Layla entered a room, followed by a resumption of movement that was just slightly too smooth, too quickly resumed. The performance of a woman who was monitoring a situation she believed was under control and simply verifying, regularly, that it remained so. Layla gave her nothing to work with. She spoke when spoken to. She smiled at appropriate intervals. She moved through her days with the same quiet efficiency she always had, and she ate nothing prepared in the main kitchen, sourcing her meals from a small corner shop 2 streets from the estate's east gate during her afternoon break. A change in routine small enough that no one would notice it. Or so she hoped. On the 4th day after she had found the jar, she woke before dawn with her voice almost entirely gone. She lay in the dark and tried to speak. Just a word. Just her own name. Just to know. And what came out was barely a thread of sound, thin and torn at the edges, like fabric pulled past its limit. She pressed her fingers against her throat and felt nothing unusual from the outside. The damage was interior. Quiet. Already further along than she had let herself believe. She got up. She dressed. She put the folded pages in her shoe. And then she did something she had never done in 2 years and 3 months of employment in that house. She walked to the end of the corridor that led to the private wing. She stood in front of the door she had never knocked on. And she raised her hand. She stood there for a long time with her knuckles an inch from the wood. She thought about what waited on the other side of that door. Not just the man, but the world he represented. A world that operated on its own terms, with its own definitions of justice and consequence, where the resolution of a problem did not always resemble anything she would have chosen. She thought about Chaewon, who was 23 years old and had a laugh she had heard once through an open doorway, and immediately recognized as the laugh of someone who had been protected their whole life, and didn't know yet what it felt like not to be. She thought about her voice. What was left of it? What would be left of it in another week if she did nothing? She knocked. The silence on the other side lasted long enough that she began to believe he wasn't there. Then the door opened. Kwon Dae-Jung looked at her the way he looked at everything. Without surprise, without performance, with the settled attention of a man who had learned long ago that the world rarely offered him anything he hadn't already considered. He was dressed, which surprised her. It was not yet 5 in the morning and he was fully dressed, which told her something about the kind of sleep he managed in this house, in this life. He looked at her face, then at her throat, then back at her face. She opened her mouth. What came out was almost nothing. A rough, broken approximation of sound that carried just enough shape to be understood as language by someone paying close attention. She said, "She put something in my food." She watched him process this. Not with visible reaction. She had not expected visible reaction from him, would not have trusted it if it came. What she watched instead was the slight, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of his stillness. The way a room changes when a decision has been made inside it, even before anyone has spoken the decision aloud. He stepped back from the door. A single step. An opening. She reached into her shoe. She held out the folded pages with both hands, the way you offer something to someone when you want them to understand that you are not asking for anything in return. Just delivery. Just the transfer of a truth from the person who had been carrying it to the person who could do something with it. He took the pages. He read them slowly, standing in the doorway in the dark corridor, and she watched his face do the thing faces do when they encounter information that confirms something they had already suspected but had not yet proven. Not shock, but a kind of quiet, terrible clarity. When he looked up, his eyes held something she had not seen there before. Not gratitude. Not quite. Something older than gratitude. Something that looked, in the half-light of that corridor, remarkably like recognition. He did not ask her to sit down. He did not ask her questions, or express disbelief, or perform any of the gestures she had been quietly bracing herself for. The skepticism of a powerful man being told something inconvenient by a woman with no leverage and a disappearing voice. He simply read the pages a second time, folded them with the same precise care she had used when she wrote them, and placed them in the interior pocket of his jacket. Then he looked at her throat. "How long?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the tone of a man who already understood the shape of the answer and was simply confirming its dimensions. She held up 4 fingers. 4 days since the kitchen. 4 days since the jar. He looked at the 4 fingers for a moment, then back at her face, and something moved through his expression so quickly she almost missed it. A tightening around the jaw. A single beat of something that in anyone else she might have called fury, but in him arrived and departed with such controlled efficiency that it left almost no trace. He said, "Go back to your room. Do not eat anything from this kitchen. Do not speak to her. Do not let her see that anything has changed." She nodded. She turned to go. "Layla." She stopped. He had never used her name before. In 2 years and 3 months, she had been addressed as the housekeeper's problem, as the staff, as a function rather than a person. The sound of her name in his voice arrived with a weight she hadn't prepared for. She turned back. He said nothing else for a moment, just looked at her with that settled, unreadable attention. Then, "You should have come sooner." It was not a reprimand. She understood that immediately. It was something closer to an acknowledgement of what she had carried alone, of the calculation she had made and remade in the dark of her room, of the particular kind of courage required to knock on a door like his before 5 in the morning, with almost no voice and nothing but 3 torn pages from a paperback novel to prove that any of it was real. She left without answering. There was nothing left of her voice to answer with. What happened next, she did not witness directly. She heard it the way you hear a storm from inside a sealed room. Not the details, but the pressure of it, the way the air in the house changed quality and weight over the following hours. She heard movement on the upper floor. Voices she couldn't make out through the walls, including one that rose briefly to a pitch she recognized as Vivienne's, and then stopped with a completeness that felt deliberate. She heard doors. She heard silence. By mid-morning, the suitcases were gone from the guest room. Vivienne Chow did not say goodbye to the staff. She did not, as far as Layla could determine, say anything at all on her way out of that house, which was, given everything, a symmetry so precise it could only have been intentional. 3 days later, a doctor arrived at the estate. Not the house physician who had diagnosed Layla's laryngite viral with the brisk efficiency of a man being paid not to find anything. This was a different doctor. Older, quieter, carrying equipment that suggested a level of specialization not typically dispatched to private residences for routine consultations. He examined her throat with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had been told exactly what to look for. He found it. He spoke to her gently, in the measured language of medicine, about what had been introduced into her system and how far it had progressed, and what remained possible and what did not. She listened without crying, which surprised her. She had expected to cry. Instead, she felt something that was not quite calm, but adjacent to it. The particular steadiness of a person who has already done the hardest part and is now simply receiving the consequences of having done it. Some of the damage was reversible, not all of it. Her voice, he told her, would return, partially, gradually, with treatment. It would not return entirely to what it had been. There would always be a roughness at the edges now, a reminder living permanently in the tissue of her throat, a scar she would carry in every word she spoke for the rest of her life. She thanked him. He left. She sat by the window in her small room and looked at the garden for a long time. The envelope came on a Friday morning, slipped under her door while she was still in bed. No knock, no announcement. Just the quiet appearance of a cream-colored rectangle on the floor. The kind of envelope that communicated its contents through its weight alone before you had opened it. Inside, a single card with no signature. On it, printed in clean type, a name and address. A medical school, a full program, a start date 4 months away. And below that, 2 words that were not an apology and not a thank you, and were somehow, precisely because of that, more than either. It said, "You're free." She read it twice. Then she set it on the nightstand beside the paperback novel with 3 pages missing from the back. And she looked at the garden again, and she breathed carefully through a throat that was already, slowly, beginning to find its way back to something it could work with. She did not pack immediately. She gave herself the morning. She made her bed with the same care she always had. She folded the uniform she would not be wearing again and left it clean on the chair. She straightened the nightstand. She ran her hand once along the windowsill. Then she packed what mattered, which was not much, but was hers. And she picked up the envelope and the novel, and she walked down the corridor and through the kitchen and out through the side door into air that smelled like morning and cut grass and the particular sharpness of a city that had been going about its business the entire time any of this was happening. She did not look back at the house. She walked to the end of the private road. She stood at the gate for a moment with the envelope in her hand, and the sun arriving low and sideways across the street, and her voice still rough and partial and permanently altered in her throat. And then she kept walking. Not away from something. That was the distinction she made, quietly, to herself, in the wordless language of a woman who had learned to think in the spaces where speech wasn't possible. Not away. Forward. Into a morning that belonged, for the first time in a long time, entirely to her. Layla Graves walked out of that mansion with almost no voice left. But she walked out. And that is the part that stays with you, because it is not just a story about a maid and a mafia boss. It is a story about a woman who learned, too late and at great cost, that staying silent to stay safe is not the same as being protected. She saw the signs. She noticed the discomfort. She carried the truth alone for weeks, and every day she waited, the damage went deeper. Some of you watching this right now know exactly what that silence costs. Not from a mansion, not from poison, but from the slow erosion of staying in something too long. From explaining yourself to someone who was never confused, just comfortable. From calling confusion chemistry, and calling control love, and calling your own instincts overthinking. If any part of Layla's story felt familiar, if you recognized her patience, her calculation, her decision to finally knock on the door, then this is for you. There is a 30-day reset created specifically for Black women who are done explaining their worth and ready to become harder to confuse. It walks you through how to see manipulation early, how to stop abandoning yourself to preserve connection, and how to rebuild standards that actually protect your peace. It is not about becoming hard. It is about becoming clear. The link is in the pinned comment below. Go check it out. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been underestimated? Treated as if your silence meant you had nothing to say? As if your position meant you had nothing to offer? When the truth was that you were carrying something that could change everything? Have you ever had to choose between staying safe and doing what was right, knowing that speaking up might cost you more than staying quiet ever would? And have you ever been protected, truly protected, not because of what you could offer, but simply because of who you are? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, courage, and truth, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.